Today's video is brought to you by The Daily Upside, a free newsletter that's delivering you financial news and context to your inbox every weekday. Look, it's 2022, and you know what the deal is with news? It's pretty biased, it's untrustworthy, it's also expensive. Every time you go outside, you're like, oh hey paywall, how much do I have to pay? Okay, no. It's time-consuming, it's somehow too sensationalist, and also it manages to be boring all at the same time. Fortunately, there's The Daily Upside, which was founded in 2019 by a group of bankers and journalists to provide fast, easy, actionable insights into the world of financial news. Every weekday, before the markets open, The Daily Upside delivers a morning briefing followed by more detailed stories that are shaping the business world, and they go directly to your inbox. Think of it as a 5-minute brief to prime you on whatever you might need to know for the day. On top of that, they also write a deeper, once-a-week newsletter that explains more complex business trends, giving you that sweet, sweet financial knowledge you need to sound smart at happy hour, or you can use it for whatever you're up to. The Daily Upside is read by more than 300,000 subscribers, including yours truly, right here, because, well, facts have to come from somewhere. So if you want to sign up for The Daily Upside, just click the link in the description box below and you can get free daily news sent straight to your inbox. And of course, if you don't like it, you could just unsubscribe, can't you? Simple. Brilliant. Love it. So yeah, go check out Daily Upside using the link in the description below. And now, today's video. The Battle of Waterloo is one of the most famous battles in world history. Most everyone has heard of the dramatic clash between the French Emperor Napoleon and the British Duke of Wellington, two of the most celebrated generals of the age. But there was a third figure that was equally important in the outcome of that battle and the war that preceded it. Prussian Field Marshal Gebhard von Blucher had risen from obscurity to become his nation's most beloved soldier, and everything he'd experienced in his 72 years of life had led him to this point, to this dramatic fight at Waterloo. The story of the man known as Marshal Forward is a dramatic tale, one filled with glorious cavalry charges, political intrigue, humiliating defeat, and ultimately victory and redemption. The battle over his legacy has been at times as fierce as the battles he fought against Napoleon, and has certainly been coloured by modern perspectives. It's why, despite being one of the most important figures in the Napoleonic Wars, he has almost been erased from the public consciousness. Gebhard Liebrecht von Blucher was born on December 16, 1742, in the Baltic port city of Rostock, then part of the Duchy of Mecklenburg. Early on, it seemed apparent that Gebhard, along with his 5 older brothers, were destined for a career in the military. His father had been a soldier, and when you were a member of the landless minor nobility, few other career paths were available. Fortunately, the constantly shifting political landscape of 18th century Europe provided plenty of opportunity for military-minded men. The great powers were constantly fighting each other for influence and territory within the dozens of minor principalities that make up modern-day Germany. In 1756, all of Europe went to war, with Great Britain and Prussia on one side, and France, Austria, and Sweden on the other. Much of the action in the 7 Years' War was in Germany, as all of Prussia's neighbours joined together in an attempt to bring the upstart power to heel. Unable to resist the promise of adventure, 15-year-old Gebhard von Blucher joined the Swedish army as a cornet, or ensign, in 1758. He signed on with the Hussar Regiment, light cavalry, which was known for lightning-fast raids behind enemy lines, riding and fighting hard, and, well, drinking and partying even harder. It's easy to see how a teenager would be enamored by the glorious lifestyle of the Hussars, even if the boy didn't speak a single word of Swedish. In August 1760, during his third campaign with the Swedes, the 17-year-old Blucher was captured by Prussian cavalry during a reconnaissance mission. Rather than face a long internment as a prisoner of war, the commander of the Prussian regiment convinced Blucher to switch sides and join the Prussian army instead. Having no particular loyalty to Sweden, the boy absolutely agreed, and so he became Cornet Blucher of the Prussian cavalry, an association that was going to last for the rest of his life. Blucher spent the remainder of the war fighting with the Prussians, and he remained in the army even after the conflict ended. He next saw action in Poland in 1769 when Prussia annexed the Polish province known as West Prussia, sending in troops to back up their claim of sovereignty. Initially given credit for fighting well, Captain Blucher found himself in trouble along with the rest of his regiment for his treatment of the native Poles, including a priest that Blucher held a mock trial for and then pretended to execute by firing squad. Fortunately, the guns were unloaded. The Prussian monarch, Frederick the Great, blamed the regiment for bringing dishonor to the Prussian army and refused to recommend any of its officers for promotion. Being passed over rather prickled the pride of the notoriously sensitive Blucher, and in a rather dramatic gesture, he handed in his resignation to the army. To his surprise, it was actually accepted by Frederick, who said that Captain Blucher can go to the devil. After 12 years of service, Blucher was out on his ear, and it looked like his days of military service were over. Blucher decided to make a go of being a country gentleman. By all accounts, he was a successful estate manager and was popular in the community of Stargard, today part of Poland. But he grew bored with civilian life and he itched to put his uniform back on and heft the saber once again. Starting in 1778, he began a sustained letter campaign to King Frederick in an attempt to convince the monarch to reinstate him. The letters took on an increasingly pleading tone as the years passed, but the king remained unmoved. It was not until Frederick died in 1786 that Blucher entertained any real hope of being reappointed to the army. After meeting and impressing the new king, Frederick William II, Blucher was finally given a commission as a major in 1787, ending almost 15 years of exile. Blucher was right at home in the army, being given command of a Hussar squadron, and he was quickly promoted to lieutenant colonel. War broke out again in 1792, prompted by the extraordinary revolution taking place in France. In Paris, the people of France had risen up to overthrow King Louis XVI, installing a republican form of government in the monarchy's place. This rather alarmed the rest of Europe's crowned heads, including Austria and Prussia, who joined forces in an alliance to invade France and restore Louis to his throne. Along with Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, the conflict became known as the War of the First Coalition, one of 7 coalitions that would eventually be arrayed against France over the following quarter century. For over 2 years, the Allies and the French fought an inconclusive series of campaigns against each other. On paper, the overwhelming might of the professional Allied armies should have decisively defeated a country where most of their military officers had been purged in the Reign of Terror. But the French were able to keep up thanks to 2 factors. They employed a levy en masse, a massive conscription program that allowed France to deploy a far larger army than any of her enemies. And they were also able to take advantage of the fact that none of the Allied countries arrayed against them were able to put aside their own individual national interests in favor of defeating a common enemy. For instance, the reason Prussia pulled out of the First Coalition in 1795 was because King Frederick William needed his army to occupy Prussia's portion of the Third Partition of Poland. Both of these factors would work against the Allies throughout the Napoleonic Wars. For Gebhard von Blucher, however, the War of the First Coalition proved to be very successful. As a cavalry commander, he engaged in many successful scouting and advance guard operations on the periphery of the main Prussian army. In 1794, he was promoted to Major General, an honor that surely pleased the man if for no other reason than it promised additional opportunities to get into the action. Still, Blucher chafed at the unsatisfying conclusion to the war with France and itched for another chance to fight against the French. Ten years after Prussia ended their war with France, the European geopolitical situation had completely shifted. The French Revolution ended with the rise of General Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized power in a coup d'etat in 1799. Napoleon was quickly gaining a reputation as a military commander without peer, and the popularity he had with the French Republic through his victories allowed him to solidify his power by having the Pope crown him Emperor of the French in December 1804 at Notre Dame Cathedral. Napoleon was obsessed with the glory to be gained on the battlefield, and his aggressive stance towards his neighbors provided him with no shortage of enemies to fight against. Against, in 1805, Great Britain, France's ancient enemy, organised a new coalition to try and curtail Napoleon's ambitions. Austria, Sweden and Russia joined the alliance, but Prussia remained neutral. Once again, national interest had trumped pan-European interest. Napoleon had built the most fearsome military machine since the Roman legions, La Grande Armée. Its secrets lay in its complex organisation. It was made up of 7 corps, self-contained mini-armies that could be detached to fight as an independent unit or combined together to make an overwhelming force. Each one was commanded by one of Napoleon's marshals, his best generals, who at times could be almost as fearsome as the emperor himself. Swollen to 250,000 men by the levy en masse, and with the military genius of Napoleon commanding it, the Grande Armée ran circles around the archaic armies of the rest of Europe, whose organisation and tactics dated back to the Renaissance. In the span of 2 months, Napoleon completely destroyed the Austrian army. He captured Vienna, and then in December of 1805, he routed a second army commanded by the Russian Tsar and the Holy Roman Emperor at Austerlitz. Considered one of the greatest military victories in history, Austerlitz effectively ended the Third Coalition, with the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire being broken up to create a series of French client states to act as a buffer between France and Germany. And by the way, if you'd like to learn more about the Battle of Austerlitz, I've done an entire video on that on probably what is my newest channel, Biographics. I'll link to that below. The encroachment of French hegemony into Germany greatly alarmed the Prussians, and King Frederick William III was finally persuaded to go to war. They joined the Fourth Coalition alongside Russia, Sweden, and Great Britain, but because they waited so long to get into the conflict, they found themselves essentially facing Napoleon alone, with Austria knocked out and Russia deep within their own borders, rebuilding their forces. Compounding their error, Napoleon's army was still in Germany, finishing their campaign from 1804, practically right on Prussia's doorstep. What happened next was almost inevitable. In just 19 days, the French invaded Prussia, shattered the Prussians in the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, and captured Berlin. Prussia's losses were staggering: 65,000 casualties, 150,000 prisoners, and the death of 2 members of the royal family. Frederick William fled his capital and sought refuge with his ally, Tsar Alexander. But Napoleon was close behind. He caught up with the Russian army at Friedland in 1807 and destroyed it too, forcing Alexander to sue for peace. The Treaties of Tilsit were particularly hard on Prussia. Frederick William was forced to give up half of his territory and was hit with a bill for 150 million francs as war reparations. With Eastern Europe pacified, Napoleon departed with his Grand Army, invading the Iberian Peninsula in 1808. Left in his wake was a Prussia that was just a shadow of its former self. It was completely humiliated. Blucher was one of the few Prussian generals that had retained his honour in the aftermath of the war with France. 120 of his colleagues were either cashiered or forced to retire as Prussia sought to place blame for the disastrous performance of her army. Because of this attrition, Blucher found himself one of the most senior commanders left, and he itched for a chance to take revenge on the hated Napoleon. Prussia was in absolutely no position to resume hostilities. Instead, the following 5 years saw extensive work to reform and modernize both the Prussian government and the military service. In order to match the sheer manpower deployed by France, the army was expanded from a small cadre of professional soldiers to a national service in which every Prussian man was expected to take part. Reserve units, called Landwehr, were raised all over Prussia to complement the active units. This new army was going to utilize the same organizational structure and tactics that Napoleon had introduced in Europe. For years, the Prussian king and his ministers waited, which chafed at the sensibilities of men like Blucher, who wanted immediate war to free their country from the French yoke. Finally, at the start of 1813, Frederick William saw his chance. The previous June, Napoleon had led his Grand Army in an invasion of Russia. While initially successful, winning battles at Smolensk and Borodino, the Russians adopted a scorched earth strategy as they retreated further into the Russian interior, evacuating Moscow and leaving it an empty shell for the French to occupy in September. Lack of supplies compelled Napoleon to retreat, which quickly turned into a disaster as his men starved, horses dropped dead, and relentless attacks from Cossack cavalry ground the Grand Army to dust. Then the brutal winter set in, and it froze what was left of the army to death. As many as 380,000 French soldiers were killed in that campaign. Napoleon's reputation for invincibility had been absolutely shattered, and France's enemies saw that the time had come to take him on. Prussia formed an alliance with Russia, Sweden, and eventually Austria, which was known as the Sixth Coalition. Blucher, now promoted to Field Marshal, was given command of one of the three Allied armies, the Army of Silesia. The Allies decided on a strategy that hadn't been tried yet against Napoleon. The Emperor may be a fantastic commander, but the one thing he couldn't do was be in more than one place at the same time. The three Allied armies would attempt to maneuver around Napoleon, beating up on his subordinates and then retreating before the Emperor showed up. In this way, they hoped to whittle down his forces and lure him into a decisive battle where they, and not he, had the advantage. For months, Blucher and the other commanders were engaged in a cat-and-mouse game with their French opponents, inflicting defeats on his marshals and compelling Napoleon to retreat to the city of Leipzig, where he engaged the Allies in a 4-day-long fight that would come to be known as the Battle of the Nations. Over 500,000 soldiers fought at Leipzig, and there were 133,000 casualties, the largest European battle ever fought before World War I. By the end of it, Napoleon had lost almost 80,000 men and was forced to retreat from Germany completely, never to return. After negotiations and the war went nowhere, the Allies invaded France in January 1814. Napoleon found himself beset on all sides by enemies as the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians invaded from the east, while the British army under General Wellington attacked from Spain in the south. As the Allies advanced on Paris, Napoleon and Blucher fought a series of battles that tactically were French victories, but strategically did little more than delay the inevitable. The fact was, the Emperor was out of men, out of resources, out of territory, and out of time. On March 31st, the Allies captured Paris, and a week later, Napoleon abdicated. The war, it seemed, was finally over. Peace could not have come soon enough for the man his troops called Marshal Forward. The 71-year-old general was both physically and mentally exhausted from a year of campaigning, still recovering from a battle wound and suffering from various inflictions and ailments. Still, the old man was able to enjoy the spoils of the victory that had played a crucial role in winning over Napoleon. He was showered with gifts and titles, being named Prince Blucher of Auerstedt by King Frederick William, and travelling to London to meet the British Prince Regent, the future King George IV. After his victory lap, as the Allied army was being stood down, Blucher returned home, preparing to retire from military service. But what would any great performance ever be without an encore? In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was considered taboo to execute a crown monarch, even one you were planning on deposing. That was why, instead of killing Napoleon after he abdicated, he was instead exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. He had no intention of staying there forever, though, and on March 1st, 1815, he made his move, escaping from Elba and landing in France with a force of 1,000 men in a bid to regain his throne. Forces sent to capture him joined with him instead, and on March 20th, Napoleon was in Paris, proclaiming himself emperor once again. He claims that he wanted peace with the other countries of Europe, but the Allies absolutely weren't having it. They knew that if he was allowed to remain in power, Napoleon would eventually build up his forces again and plunge the whole continent back into war. They declared him to be an outlaw, and a seventh coalition comprising Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria was formed to stop Napoleon. Blucher was named to command the Prussian army, the Army of the Lower Rhine, currently assembling in Belgium south of Brussels. Nearby was an Anglo-Dutch army, commanded by the celebrated British general, the Duke of Wellington, who had defeated the French in the Spanish front of the war. The two armies were to wait there for more armies from Austria and Russia to arrive, and then they would all invade France in concert on or about July the 1st. Napoleon, always in favour of bold action, wasn't going to sit around and wait for that to happen. He had assembled an army of 120,000 men, mostly veterans of previous campaigns in northern France. The Emperor believed it was possible for him to destroy first Blucher and then Wellington, as long as he could keep their two armies from combining together. Then after that, he could deal with the Austrians and then the Russians. The key to success was going to be speed, organization, and audacity, all hallmark traits of the Napoleonic style of warfare. On June the 15th, Napoleon surprised the Allies when he crossed into Belgium at Charleroi in a position to divide the two armies, exactly what Wellington and Blucher didn't want. A flurry of messages went back and forth, working out the Allied response. Napoleon was going after Blucher first, so he was going to make a stand, and Wellington promised to march to support him. Blucher positioned his army at the village of Ligny, with 3 of his 4 corps in position to meet the French attack. On June the 16th, 2 battles were fought at Ligny and Quatre Bras as Napoleon sought to destroy Blucher while sending sending Marshal Ney to prevent Wellington from supporting the Prussians. At Ligny, Napoleon and Blucher traded blows in a bloody affair that caused 12,000 casualties on both sides. In the end, Napoleon emerged victorious, with an attack by his vaunted Imperial Guard proving decisive. In the latter stages of the battle, Blucher's horse was shot and collapsed on top of him, crushing his right leg and shoulder and trapping him under its dead body. His aide threw himself on top of the field marshal and dragged his cloak over him so his medals would be hidden from passing French cavalrymen, who surely would have captured him if they knew it was. The aide eventually got Blucher off the battlefield to join the retreat of his army in the wake of the defeat. Napoleon detached a third of his army under the command of Marshal Grouchy to chase the Prussians, believing them to be going east. He then turned his attention to Wellington's army, which had retreated after Quatre Bras to a defensive position just south of the village of Waterloo. But the Emperor, who believed many to be the greatest military mind since Alexander the Great, had made a crucial mistake. Blucher wasn't going east. In the past, Napoleon had exploited divisions within the Allied coalitions ranged against him, pitting one nation's interest against another in order to thwart their attempts to contain him. But after over a dozen years of war, the other nations of Europe were united against the French Emperor above all else. And what's more, they'd learned from past battles. Blucher and Wellington knew exactly what Napoleon was trying to do, and responded. Wellington made his stand at Waterloo because he knew the Prussians were coming to support him, and Blucher, instead of marching east to regroup, instead went west because he knew Wellington was there, waiting for his help. Despite his injuries, the 72-year-old general led the charge, pushing his army on relentlessly over the next 2 days to come to Wellington's aid. When he arrived late in the afternoon on the 18th, it couldn't have come at a more fortuitous moment. Wellington had been holding off attacks from Napoleon for hours, but his lines were starting to wear thin. Knowing that Blucher was coming, the Emperor had thrown in his last reserve, hoping that the Guard would break Wellington's army, just like it had done at Ligny and in every other battle it participated in dating back to 1805. Blucher's advance threatened Napoleon's right flank, forcing him to detach troops from the final assault to fend him off. Desperately, the Emperor looked for Marshal Grouchy's troops, but the Marshal was still following the Prussian army. The back end of it, that was, in accordance with Napoleon's orders. Grouchy was still miles away from the battlefield, far too far away to be any help. After a brutal fight in the village of Plassenoir, Blucher's troops succeeded in breaking through the French lines. As word of this spread through Napoleon's troops, morale plummeted. They were exhausted from the actions of the last 4 days and beset on two sides. All at once, the Emperor's army disintegrated as soldiers broke and ran, including the guardsmen. Napoleon himself only barely escaped capture, fleeing on a horse back to Paris, leaving most of his opulent possessions to be captured by the enemy. Within 2 weeks, he abdicated the throne again, this time for good. The series of wars that had begun almost without pause since 1792 were finally over. Despite calls from Blucher and the Prussians to have Napoleon executed, this time he was exiled again to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena. Guarded by British troops, he died there in 1821, eventually having his body returned to Paris for a hero's burial. It was the end of the campaign for Field Marshal Blucher as well. He retired to his estates in Silesia, living comfortably until his death in 1819, aged 77. What is strange is that despite his importance to world events, it feels like Blucher has been almost lost to history. He's certainly less well known than the other two commanders of Waterloo, despite all three of them ranking together as probably the best generals of the Napoleonic period. So what happened? Unfortunately, the blame for Blucher's disappearance has more to do with his descendants than the general himself. Throughout the 19th century, Blucher was revered as a hero by Prussia. Their army leadership, which would end up being the core of the Imperial German General Staff after unification in 1871, modelled themselves after martial forwards and planned battles based on the way that they thought Blucher would have fought them. During World War I, anything and everything associated with Germany was suddenly extremely unpopular in Europe and around the world. The British in particular, who had spent the preceding century arguing with their German counterparts about which general was more important to the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, did everything they could to bury Blucher in the pages of history, minimizing his impact on the war in order to puff up their own national hero, Wellington. Things got even worse after the Second World War, when Germany was occupied and divided by the victorious Allies, who did all that they could to erase the influence of the Prussian military establishment that they believed had led the world into war. Even today, with 80 years of separation from that unhappy time, there are few books written in English about Blucher's life and campaigns outside of Waterloo, in contrast to entire libraries of work, both dedicated to Napoleon and Wellington. It doesn't seem likely that Blucher himself would have cared very much, however. In the end, he got what he wanted: a lifetime of service in uniform, the honour and esteem of his country, and most importantly, a resounding triumph over his most hated enemy. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As I mentioned in today's video, I've got another channel called Biographics where we deal just with, surprise, surprise, wars. There's going to be a link below. Thank you for watching.